The carriage door swung open before Elena Whitmore had even finished tying the ribbon on her sleeve, and her father's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "There is no more time, Elena. Get in." She stood frozen on the cold stone steps of her family home, still holding a half-eaten piece of bread, staring at the black carriage with its silver crest gleaming in the weak sunlight. Two men she did not know stood beside it, dressed in fine coats, their faces unreadable. "Father, what is happening?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. She had heard the whispers for weeks. The debts, the letters that arrived and made her father's hands shake, the visitors who came at night and left before dawn. Her father would not look at her. "You are to be married today, to the Duke of Ashford." The words struck her harder than any blow could have. She had never met the Duke. She had only heard the stories, the same stories every servant girl and merchant's daughter in the county whispered behind closed hands. The Duke who never left his estate. The Duke who had not walked in years, ever since some terrible accident no one could quite explain. The Duke who was said to sit alone in a dark room, refusing every visitor, every friend, every family member who dared to come near him.
"I will not," Elena said, though her voice trembled.
"You will," her father answered, and for the first time, she saw something break in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or fear. "This is the only way to save this family. The Duke's steward has already signed the papers. Today is the day." She wanted to run. She wanted to scream until the whole village came out of their homes to see what was happening to her. But she looked at her father's face, at the deep lines of worry carved into it, and she understood there was no other road left for either of them to walk. She climbed into the carriage. The ride to Ashford Manor took most of the day. Elena watched the green hills fade into thick, dark forest, and then into iron gates so tall they seemed to touch the clouds. When the carriage finally stopped, she stepped out into a courtyard so silent it felt as though the entire estate was holding its breath. A tall man in a gray coat approached her. He introduced himself as Griggs, the Duke's steward, and his expression was polite but distant, like a man used to keeping secrets locked behind a calm face. "The ceremony will be brief," Griggs said. "His Grace does not care for long occasions." Elena barely had time to smooth her dress before she was led into a small chapel at the back of the manor. There were no guests, no flowers, no music, only a priest, waiting with tired eyes, and a man seated in a wooden chair with wheels, positioned near the altar. This was her husband. Duke Alaric Ashford did not look up when she entered. His dark hair fell over his forehead, and his jaw was set tight, as though he was holding something back with great effort. His shoulders were broad, his frame still strong despite the chair that carried him, and for a moment, Elena wondered how a man who looked so powerful could be so broken. The priest spoke the words of the ceremony quickly. Elena repeated her vows in a voice that did not feel like her own. When it came time for the Duke to speak his half, his voice was low, steady, and strangely careful, as though every word had been chosen in advance. He never once met her eyes. When it was over, Griggs wheeled the Duke away without a single word passing between the newly married couple. Elena stood alone in the chapel, still wearing her wedding dress, wondering if she had just married a ghost. That night, a maid named Nora led her to a bedroom in the east wing of the manor, far from the Duke's private chambers. The room was beautiful, filled with fine furniture and soft candlelight, but it felt like a cage all the same. "Is he always so silent?" Elena asked, unable to stop herself. Nora hesitated before answering. "His Grace keeps to himself, my lady. Ever since the accident, he does not receive visitors, not even family." "What kind of accident was it?" Nora's eyes flickered toward the door, as though checking for someone listening. "No one really knows. He was found injured in the West Tower one night, years ago. After that, he could not walk. The doctors say his legs were damaged beyond repair." "You do not sound convinced," Elena said quietly. Nora gave a small, nervous smile and said nothing more. She curtsied and left the room, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the flickering candle. For the first few days, Elena barely saw her husband at all. She learned the shape of her new home slowly, wandering through long hallways lined with paintings of ancestors she did not know, past locked doors that no one would explain, past guards stationed in places that made little sense for a manor with no enemies. She noticed things, small things. A guard positioned outside her own bedroom door at night, though she had been told it was for her protection. Another guard near the West Tower, a place Nora always seemed eager to steer her away from. The way the household staff spoke of the Duke in hushed, careful tones, as if his name itself was dangerous to say too loudly. One afternoon, while exploring a gallery she had not yet seen, Elena came across a large portrait hanging near the end of the hall. It showed a young man standing tall and proud, dressed in a fine hunting coat, a bow slung over one shoulder, his eyes bright with confidence. It took her a moment to recognize the face. It was Alaric, before the accident, before the chair, before the silence. She stood in front of the painting for a long time, studying the strength in his stance, the light in his eyes, trying to reconcile this vibrant young man with the withdrawn figure she had married. Something about the painting unsettled her, though she could not say exactly what. That evening, as she made her way back to her room, she passed the Duke's study. The door was slightly open, and she could hear his voice inside, speaking quietly to Griggs. "If Cassius sends anyone else to inspect the accounts, you are to tell them nothing," the Duke was saying, his voice sharp and clear, nothing like the careful, halting tone he had used during their wedding vows. Elena froze in the hallway, her heart beating fast. "And the girl?" Griggs asked. "Your wife?" There was a long pause before the Duke answered. "She knows nothing. Keep it that way." Elena stepped back from the door as quietly as she could, her mind racing. The girl. Keep it that way. She was not meant to know something, and whatever it was, it seemed to matter greatly to her new husband. She returned to her room that night, but sleep did not come easily. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the strength in the Duke's voice, so different from the broken man she had married. She thought of the portrait of the young, proud nobleman with his bow and his bright eyes. She thought of the guards stationed in strange places, the locked doors, the whispered name of a man called Cassius who seemed to frighten the entire household without ever setting foot inside it. Elena had come to Ashford Manor believing she was marrying a broken man out of duty and necessity, but lying there in the darkness, listening to the wind press against her window, she began to understand that nothing in this house was quite what it appeared to be. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear and the anger at being forced into this marriage, a quiet and dangerous curiosity had begun to stir. She did not yet know what secrets lived within the walls of Ashford Manor, but she was certain of one thing. She intended to find out. The days at Ashford Manor began to take on a strange rhythm. Elena would wake with the sun, take her breakfast alone in a small dining room overlooking the eastern gardens, and spend her mornings wandering the manor, always careful to appear as though she was simply passing time rather than searching for answers. She had learned quickly that the household staff were loyal to the Duke in ways that went beyond ordinary service. They watched her with polite, careful eyes, answering her questions with just enough information to satisfy her without ever revealing anything of real substance. She barely saw Alaric. He kept to his private wing, a section of the manor she was told not to enter without invitation, and most of what she knew of him came from fragments of conversation overheard in hallways, or the careful, guarded answers of servants who clearly feared saying too much. It was Nora who eventually became her closest source of comfort, if not information. The young maid had a kind face and gentle manner, and though she was careful with her words, Elena sensed a genuine warmth in her that the rest of the household lacked. "Has the Duke always kept himself so hidden?" Elena asked one morning, as Nora helped her dress. "Since the accident, my lady," Nora said, tightening the laces of Elena's gown. "Before that, he was different. He used to ride out every morning. He loved the hunt. He would spend hours in the library, arguing with his father about matters of the estate. Everyone said he would make a fine duke one day." "And after the accident?" Nora's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "After that, he stopped riding, stopped everything. He shut himself away, and things have not been the same since." Elena thought of the portrait she had found, the bright-eyed young man with his bow and his confident stance, and tried to picture him confined to a chair, unable to walk, unable to ride, unable to do any of the things that had once given him joy. It should have filled her with sympathy. Instead, it left her with more questions than before. "Does he ever speak of what happened, the accident itself?" "No, my lady," Nora said quickly, glancing toward the door as though the very question might summon trouble. "No one speaks of that, not even the staff who were here at the time." That evening, Elena decided to explore the West Tower, the section of the manor that Nora always seemed careful to steer her away from. She waited until the household had settled for the night, took a small lamp from her room, and made her way through the quiet corridors, her footsteps as light as she could manage. The West Tower was older than the rest of the manor, its stone walls rougher, its air colder. A narrow staircase spiraled upward into darkness, and Elena climbed it slowly, her lamp casting long shadows against the walls. At the top, she found a heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped into a room that had clearly not been used in years. Dust covered every surface. A broken chair lay on its side near the window, and deep scratches marked the stone floor, as though something had been dragged across it long ago. Elena's lamplight fell across a dark stain on the floorboards, old and faded, but unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. This was where it had happened. Whatever accident had left the Duke unable to walk, it had happened in this very room. She knelt down carefully, studying the marks on the floor, the broken furniture, the way the window latch appeared to have been forced from the outside rather than the inside. An accident did not usually leave marks like these. A sound from the stairwell below made her jump, and she quickly extinguished her lamp, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. Footsteps echoed up the staircase, slow and deliberate. Elena's heart pounded as she waited, certain she would be discovered, certain her curiosity had finally led her into real danger. But the footsteps stopped before reaching the top, and after a long moment of silence, they retreated back down the stairs. Elena waited until she was certain she was alone, before relighting her lamp and making her way carefully back to her own room, her mind spinning with everything she had seen. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Ashford Manor. Elena was in the garden when she heard the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, and looked up to see an elegant black carriage pulling through the main gates, bearing a crest similar to the Duke's own, though subtly different. "Who is arriving?" she asked Nora, who had come to fetch her for the midday meal. Nora's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "That would be Lord Cassius Ashford, my lady, His Grace's cousin." The name struck Elena immediately. Cassius, the very name she had heard whispered behind the Duke's study door, the name that had seemed to carry such weight and danger in Alaric's voice. Lord Cassius proved to be a tall, handsome man with an easy smile and manners so polished they felt almost rehearsed. He greeted Elena with great warmth, complimenting her on her beauty and her fine taste in dress, and expressing what seemed to be genuine concern for her well-being in her new home. "It must be difficult," he said, as they walked together through the manor's grand hall, "being married to a man who can offer you so little. My cousin was once the finest hunter in the county, the most sought-after young lord in 3 provinces. Now look at him, a shadow of what he was. He seems to manage his affairs well enough," Elena said carefully, unsure why she felt the need to defend a husband who had barely spoken 10 words to her since their wedding. Cassius smiled, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Of course, Griggs sees to most things now, does he not? It is a shame, truly. The estate deserves a duke who can stand before his people, not one who must be wheeled from room to room like an invalid child." Elena said nothing, though she noted the way Cassius's words carried an edge of impatience beneath their polished surface, as though he were waiting for something, counting down toward some outcome he expected but had not yet achieved. Later that day she caught sight of Cassius speaking quietly with 2 of the household guards near the stables, his voice low, his manner far less charming than it had been in her presence. She could not hear the words exchanged, but she recognized the shape of instruction in his gestures, the way the guards nodded and glanced around before responding. That night, unable to sleep, Elena made her way toward the Duke's private wing, drawn by a need to understand more than she had been given. She had not intended to be seen, but as she rounded a corner near his study, she nearly collided with Griggs himself. "My lady," Griggs said, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes held a warning. "His Grace does not receive visitors at this hour." "I only wish to ask him something," Elena said. "Perhaps in the morning," Griggs replied, and though his words were polite, there was no mistaking the firmness beneath them. He guided her gently but insistently back toward her own wing of the manor, and Elena understood, with growing certainty, that she was being managed, watched, kept at a careful distance from whatever truth lived behind those private doors. Over the following days, Elena continued her quiet investigation, moving carefully so as not to draw attention. She began spending time in the manor's library, searching through old records and family histories, hoping to find some mention of the accident that had changed Alaric's life so completely. Most of what she found was frustratingly vague, official reports that spoke only of an unfortunate fall, with no further detail offered. But tucked inside an old ledger, forgotten between pages recording household expenses from years past, she found a folded letter, its ink faded, but still legible. It was addressed to a physician whose name she did not recognize, and it spoke of injuries that did not match the story of a simple fall. The letter mentioned bruising consistent with restraint, and questioned why the household guards had been dismissed from their posts on the very night of the incident. Elena's hands trembled as she read the words a second time. This was no accident. Someone had done this to Alaric, deliberately, and the truth had been buried for years beneath careful stories and closed doors. She thought of Cassius's cold eyes, his impatient questions about the estate's future, his quiet conversations with the guards. She thought of the Duke's own voice through the study door, warning Griggs to keep certain matters hidden from her. Whatever had happened in that West Tower years ago, Elena was now certain of one thing. Her husband was not simply a broken man hiding from the world. He was a man in hiding, carefully guarding secrets that someone, somewhere, would very much like to see remain buried forever. And she had just found the first thread that might unravel it all. Elena kept the letter hidden inside the lining of her jewelry box, taking it out only when she was certain no one else was near. She read it again and again over the following days, memorizing every line, searching for some detail she might have missed. The physician's name meant nothing to her, but she was determined to find out who he was and whether he still lived within reach. She began asking careful questions among the older members of the household staff, framing her curiosity as simple interest in the manor's history, rather than anything more pointed. Most gave her the same vague answers Nora had offered weeks before, but one elderly groundskeeper, a man named Old Ferris who had served the family for nearly 40 years, let something slip that the others had not. "Dr. Holloway," he said, when Elena mentioned the name from the letter, his eyes narrowing with something like suspicion. "Now, there's a name I haven't heard spoken in this house for a long time. He used to tend to the family before the young master's accident. Vanished not long after, if I recall. Some said he moved away. Others said he was paid to disappear." "Paid by whom?" Elena asked, careful to keep her voice light and casual. Old Ferris looked around before answering, lowering his voice. "That, my lady, I couldn't say. But I remember the night of the accident well enough. The guards were all sent away on some errand or another. Every last one of them, all at once. Strange thing that. Never happened before or since. Then the household woke to find the young master injured in the tower and Dr. Holloway called in secret, not the usual family physician. This was more than Elena had learned in weeks of careful searching. The guards dismissed. A secret physician summoned instead of the family's usual doctor. A letter questioning the true nature of the Duke's injuries. Everything pointed toward a truth far darker than a simple accident, and every thread seemed to lead back toward the same unanswered question. Who had wanted Alaric harmed, and why had the truth been buried so carefully ever since? She thought again of Cassius, his easy charm and his impatient eyes, his quiet conversations with the guards near the stables. If someone had wanted the young Duke removed from his position all those years ago, who stood to gain more than the cousin now waiting so eagerly for his chance to inherit? Elena's investigation grew bolder in the days that followed, though she tried to remain careful. She began paying closer attention to the guards stationed throughout the manor, noting which ones seemed loyal to Griggs and the Duke, and which ones exchanged quiet, private words whenever Cassius visited. She noticed that certain rooms were always locked when Cassius arrived, and that Griggs seemed to grow more tense with each of his cousin's visits, as though bracing himself for some inevitable confrontation. One afternoon, while Cassius was again visiting the manor, Elena decided to search his private carriage while it stood empty near the stables, the driver having wandered off toward the kitchens for refreshment. It was a reckless decision, and she knew it even as she made her way quietly across the courtyard, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside the carriage, she found little of immediate interest until her eyes fell upon a leather satchel tucked beneath the seat. Inside, she discovered a stack of papers detailing financial transactions, transfers of funds from the estate's accounts to names she did not recognize, dated across several years. The sums were significant, far more than any ordinary business dealings would require, and the pattern of the transfers suggested something being carefully siphoned away, hidden beneath layers of false records. She had barely finished reading when she heard footsteps approaching the carriage. Elena quickly returned the papers to the satchel and slipped out the opposite door, pressing herself against the shadowed side of the stable wall just as the driver returned to his post. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it could be heard across the courtyard, but the driver noticed nothing amiss, and after a tense moment, Elena made her way back into the manor, her mind racing with everything she had just discovered. Embezzlement, falsified accounts, money disappearing from the estate for years, likely funneled toward whatever plans Cassius had been quietly building since his cousin's accident. It was becoming clearer with each new discovery that Cassius had far more at stake in the Duke's continued weakness than mere family concern. If the estate's true financial records were ever properly examined, if the truth of that night in the West Tower were ever fully uncovered, Cassius stood to lose everything, and likely faced far worse than simple disgrace. That evening, unable to contain her growing sense of urgency, Elena made her way once more toward the Duke's private wing. She understood the risk of being turned away again, of Griggs intercepting her before she could reach her husband, but she felt she could no longer simply wait and watch from the shadows. Whatever truth lived behind those closed doors, she needed to understand it, both for her own safety and for whatever fragile future she and Alaric might yet build together. This time she avoided the main corridor Griggs typically patrolled, instead taking a narrower servants' passage she had discovered during her explorations of the manor. It led her directly to a small door near the Duke's study, one she suspected few outside the household staff even knew existed. She pressed her ear against the wood and heard voices within, Alaric's low and steady, another she recognized as belonging to a man who occasionally visited under the guise of estate business but whom she now suspected served some deeper purpose. The ledgers from 3 years past should be enough to prove the pattern, the unfamiliar voice was saying. Combined with what Holloway is finally willing to testify, we may have enough to bring this before the Crown's own investigators. It must be enough, Alaric replied, his voice carrying an intensity Elena had never heard from him before. I have waited long enough. Every year I remain hidden behind this chair. Cassius grows bolder, more certain of his eventual victory. I will not allow him to succeed. Elena's breath caught. Dr. Holloway, ledgers, evidence being gathered, apparently for years, against Cassius. Everything she had painstakingly uncovered on her own, it seemed Alaric had already known, had perhaps orchestrated far more of it than she could have imagined. She must have shifted against the door, for a floorboard creaked beneath her weight, and the voices within fell suddenly silent. Before she could retreat, the door opened, and she found herself face to face with her husband, seated in his chair but very much alert, his eyes sharp and assessing in a way she had never witnessed before. Elena, he said, his voice carrying none of the careful blankness she had come to expect. How much did you hear? There was no point in pretending otherwise. Enough to know that your accident was no accident at all, she said, standing firm despite the tremor in her hands. Enough to know that Cassius has been stealing from this estate for years, and that you have been gathering evidence against him in secret, all while pretending to be broken in front of everyone, including me. The man who had been speaking with Alaric excused himself quietly, slipping past Elena with a respectful nod, leaving husband and wife alone in the dim candlelight of the study. Alaric studied her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, replaced instead by something closer to weariness. You should not have followed that conversation, Elena. For your own protection, it would be better if you knew nothing of this. I am your wife, Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Whether either of us wished for this marriage or not, I am tied to your fate now as much as my own. If there is danger in this house, I would rather understand it than remain blind to it. Alaric's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might simply dismiss her again, retreat back behind the careful silence he had maintained since their wedding day. But something in her words seemed to reach him, some recognition of the truth she had spoken. Sit down, he said finally, gesturing toward the chair across from his own. If you insist on knowing, then I will not insult you further with lies. Elena sat, her heart still racing, uncertain what truths were about to be revealed, but sensing that everything about her life at Ashford Manor was about to change. 3 years ago, Alaric began, his voice low and measured. I discovered evidence that Cassius had been altering the estate's financial records, diverting significant sums toward accounts I could not trace. When I confronted him privately, he denied everything, but I saw the fear behind his denial. I knew then that he would not simply allow the matter to rest. He paused, his hands tightening against the arms of his chair. Weeks later, I was attacked in the West Tower, struck and left for injuries that nearly killed me. When I woke, Dr. Holloway informed me privately that my legs had sustained damage, though not beyond all hope of recovery given time and careful treatment. But I understood immediately that if Cassius believed his attempt had succeeded in breaking me entirely, he would grow complacent, careless. He would continue his schemes believing himself safe from any true challenge to his ambitions. Elena stared at him, pieces of the puzzle finally settling into place. You pretended to remain paralyzed, even after you had begun to heal. It was the only way to gather the proof I needed without alerting him to the danger he was truly in, Alaric said. Every guard loyal to his cause, every servant who might report back to him, needed to believe completely in my helplessness. It has taken years to gather enough evidence to ensure his downfall would be absolute, that he could not simply escape consequence through influence or bribery. And my marriage to you, Elena said slowly, understanding dawning with painful clarity. Was that part of this scheme as well? Alaric's expression shifted, something like genuine regret crossing his features. Your father's debts made you a convenient match, one that would not draw suspicion, one that Cassius would view as further proof of my continued weakness. I am sorry, Elena. I did not intend for you to become entangled in danger that was never yours to bear. Elena sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything she had just learned. Anger simmered beneath her thoughts, at having been used as a piece in a larger scheme without her knowledge or consent. But beneath that anger, she found something else stirring as well. Understanding, and perhaps, unexpectedly, a flicker of admiration for a man who had endured years of pretended weakness in pursuit of a truth that could cost him everything if it failed. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Alaric met her eyes, and for the first time since their wedding day, she saw something genuine there, something that felt less like careful calculation and more like honest connection. "Now, I believe, we finish what I began. Together, if you are willing." Elena thought of the guards watching her bedroom door, the locked rooms whenever Cassius visited, the years of careful deception woven throughout this entire household. She thought of her own father, forced into desperate arrangements by circumstances beyond his control, and of the courage it must have taken Alaric to endure so much silent suffering in pursuit of justice. "I am willing," she said quietly, "but I will not be kept in the dark any longer. If we are to face Cassius together, then I must know everything, every piece of the plan, every risk we face." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "Very well, Elena, then let us begin." Outside the study window, the moon hung low over the manor's dark gardens, and somewhere beyond the estate's tall gates, Cassius Ashford slept peacefully in his own home, entirely unaware that the careful web of deception he had spun for years was finally beginning to unravel. In the weeks that followed, the household of Ashford Manor began to change in ways only Elena and Alaric truly understood. To the outside world, nothing appeared different. The Duke remained in his chair, quiet and withdrawn as ever, and his young wife continued her daily walks through the gardens and her quiet hours in the library. But behind the closed doors of the private study, a different truth was taking shape entirely. Alaric introduced Elena to the small circle of people he trusted completely, a group far smaller than she had imagined given the scope of what they had been working toward. There was Griggs, of course, whose careful, distant manner Elena now understood as a mask worn to protect his master's secrets. There was Dr. Holloway, an older man with tired eyes and steady hands, who had risked his own safety for years by refusing to fully falsify his medical reports, leaving instead careful ambiguities that Alaric had always intended to use as evidence when the time came. And there was a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Callahan, a former investigator for the Crown who had been secretly assisting Alaric in tracing the stolen funds through their various hidden accounts. "We have gathered enough evidence to prove the embezzlement beyond question," Callahan explained during one of their evening meetings, spreading a collection of documents across the study table. "The falsified ledgers, the transfers to accounts under false names, the timing of each transaction against decisions Cassius made regarding estate business. It paints a clear picture of years of systematic theft. But theft alone will not be enough," Alaric said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Cassius has influence within certain circles of the Crown's court. If we present only evidence of financial crimes, he may find a way to negotiate leniency, perhaps even avoid consequence entirely through connections and bribery." "Then we need proof of the attack itself," Elena said, surprising herself with the confidence in her own voice. She had grown more comfortable speaking freely during these meetings, no longer the frightened bride who had arrived at Ashford Manor believing herself simply a pawn in a marriage of convenience. "Proof that connects Cassius directly to what happened in the West Tower." Dr. Holloway's expression grew grave. "I can testify to the true nature of the Duke's injuries, that they were consistent with an attack rather than an accidental fall. But testimony alone from a single physician may not withstand the scrutiny of Cassius's allies within the court. There is something else," Alaric said slowly, glancing toward Elena with an expression she could not quite read. "The guards who were dismissed that night. If we could locate even one of them, someone willing to testify to having received orders to abandon their posts, and from whom those orders originated, it would connect Cassius directly to the events of that evening." Elena thought of the letter she had discovered in the old ledger weeks before, and of old Ferris's careful, cautious words about the guards being sent away that fateful night. "I may know where to begin looking," she said, and explained what the elderly groundskeeper had told her. Over the following days, Elena and Callahan worked together to trace the identities of the guards who had served the household during that time, most of whom had long since moved away from the region. It was slow, careful work, requiring discretion at every turn, for they could not risk word reaching Cassius that his cousin's household was actively investigating the events of years past. During this time, something else began to shift between Elena and Alaric, something neither of them had anticipated when their forced marriage first began. Freed from the necessity of maintaining his careful facade in her presence, Alaric revealed himself to be a man of sharp intelligence and quiet determination, someone whose years of enforced silence had clearly weighed heavily upon him despite the necessity of the deception. Elena found herself drawn to the strength beneath his careful exterior, the resilience it must have taken to endure so much suffering in pursuit of a justice that might never fully arrive. For his part, Alaric found himself increasingly grateful for Elena's presence, her sharp observations often proving as valuable as Callahan's careful investigative work. She noticed details others overlooked, remembered fragments of conversation that others might have dismissed as unimportant, and possessed a courage in the face of danger that surprised even herself. "You did not have to involve yourself so deeply in this," Alaric said one evening, as they reviewed documents together in the quiet study, the candles burning low around them. "I could have kept you separate from all of this, allowed you to live your life at the manor without the burden of such dangerous knowledge." "Would you have preferred that?" Elena asked, looking up from the papers before her. Alaric was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "No," he admitted finally. "I find that I would not have preferred that at all." Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but undeniable, a recognition of connection that neither of them had expected to find within the confines of a marriage born from necessity and deception, rather than genuine choice. Their investigation continued to build momentum in the weeks that followed. Callahan eventually located one of the dismissed guards, a man named Wesley Barrow, now working as a blacksmith in a distant village, who had carried the weight of guilt over what had happened that night for years. Under careful questioning, and with assurances of protection from any retribution Cassius might attempt, Wesley agreed to provide testimony confirming that he and his fellow guards had received direct orders that evening, orders bearing Cassius's own seal, instructing them to abandon their posts for several hours under the pretense of urgent business elsewhere on the estate grounds. With Wesley's testimony secured, alongside Dr. Holloway's medical evidence and the financial records Callahan had painstakingly assembled, the case against Cassius grew formidable indeed. Yet Alaric remained cautious, aware that Cassius still possessed influence and resources that could complicate any direct confrontation. "We must present this evidence carefully," Alaric explained during what would prove to be one of their final planning sessions before taking action. "If Cassius senses any hint that we are prepared to move against him, he may attempt to destroy evidence, silence witnesses, or flee entirely before facing consequence. Then we must ensure he has no warning at all," Elena said. "A single, decisive presentation of everything we have gathered, made directly before witnesses whose authority Cassius cannot easily dismiss or corrupt." Callahan nodded in agreement. "I have connections within the Crown's own investigative office, individuals whose integrity cannot be questioned. If we can arrange for them to be present at the manor under some pretense that will not alert Cassius to our true purpose, we may be able to present the full weight of evidence in a single, undeniable moment." Plans began to take careful shape over the following days. Alaric would host a formal gathering at the manor, ostensibly to discuss matters of estate business with his cousin, an event that would not appear unusual given the ongoing tensions between them regarding financial oversight. Callahan's contacts within the Crown's investigative office would attend under the guise of routine estate auditors, their true purpose hidden until the moment evidence was formally presented. Elena found herself both anxious and strangely exhilarated as the day of the gathering approached. She understood the risks involved, the possibility that Cassius might sense danger and attempt some desperate action, rather than accept quiet defeat. Yet she also understood the necessity of finally confronting the truth that had haunted this household for years, of freeing Alaric from the exhausting burden of his careful deception, and of ensuring that justice, so long delayed, would finally be served. The night before the gathering, Elena found herself unable to sleep, and made her way quietly to the manor's private study, where she found Alaric still awake, reviewing documents by candlelight. "You should be resting," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "As should you," he replied, though a faint smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since their wedding day. "I find myself unable to quiet my thoughts, knowing what tomorrow may bring." "Are you frightened?" Elena asked. Alaric considered the question carefully before answering. "I have spent years pretending to be broken, Elena. Tomorrow, I intend to finally stand again, both literally and in every sense that matters. There is fear in that, certainly, but there is also something else, something closer to relief." Elena reached across the table, her hand finding his, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the quiet candlelight, bound not by the forced circumstances of their marriage, but by something far more genuine that had grown quietly between them over the past weeks. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Elena said finally, You will not face it alone. Alaric's fingers tightened around hers, and in his eyes, Elena saw not the careful, guarded man she had married weeks before, but someone entirely different, someone who had finally allowed himself, if only for this quiet moment, to be truly seen. The morning of the gathering arrived with a clear, pale sky stretching over Ashford Manor, offering no hint of the momentous events about to unfold within its walls. Elena dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue that Nora had prepared for her, and studied her reflection in the mirror for a long moment, wondering if the woman staring back at her truly understood the weight of what the day ahead would bring. By mid-morning, carriages began arriving at the manor's gates. Cassius arrived first, dressed in his finest coat, his easy smile firmly in place as he greeted Elena in the main hall with his usual polished charm. "You look radiant this morning," he said, taking her hand and bowing slightly. "Married life at Ashford Manor appears to suit you, despite its obvious limitations." Elena forced a smile in return, careful to reveal nothing of the tension coiled tightly within her chest. "You are too kind, my lord. Shall we proceed to the drawing room? I believe my husband is eager to discuss matters of the estate with you today." If Cassius noticed anything unusual in her tone, he gave no indication, following her toward the drawing room with the same confident stride he always carried, a man entirely certain of his own position and safety within these walls. The additional guests arrived shortly after, a group of 3 men Cassius was informed were routine auditors sent to review the estate's financial records as part of standard practice following the recent marriage. Cassius greeted them with polite indifference, clearly viewing their presence as a minor inconvenience rather than any genuine threat, and Elena felt a small measure of relief at how easily the deception had been accepted. Alaric was wheeled into the drawing room by Griggs precisely as the gathering assembled, his posture careful and controlled, his expression the same careful blankness he had maintained for years in his cousin's presence. Elena took her place beside him, her hand resting lightly on the arm of his chair, and watched as Cassius settled into a comfortable seat across the room, entirely unaware of the evidence about to be presented against him. "Cousin," Cassius began, his tone carrying its usual note of practiced sympathy, "I trust you are managing well despite the added responsibilities of your recent marriage. It cannot be easy, given your circumstances." "I manage well enough," Alaric replied, his voice carrying the same careful weariness Elena had grown accustomed to hearing him use in Cassius's presence. "Though I confess, there are matters requiring clarification regarding the estate's recent financial records. Mr. Callahan here has been assisting with a thorough review." Callahan, seated quietly among the group of supposed auditors, stepped forward at this cue, opening a leather case containing the carefully organized evidence they had spent months assembling. "If it please the gathering, I have discovered certain irregularities within the estate's accounts that warrant further discussion." Cassius's easy smile faltered only slightly, though Elena, watching closely, caught the brief flash of unease that crossed his features before he recovered his composure. "Irregularities? I am certain there is a simple explanation. Estate finances can grow complicated across many years." "Indeed," Callahan continued, withdrawing several documents from his case. "Though these particular irregularities span a consistent pattern across the past several years, all pointing toward funds diverted from the estate's primary accounts into holdings registered under names that, upon investigation, appear to be false identities." The color drained slightly from Cassius's face, though he maintained his composure admirably. "Surely you are not suggesting I bear any responsibility for such matters. I have only ever acted in the estate's best interests." "Perhaps you might explain then," Callahan said, his tone carrying a quiet edge of authority Elena had not heard from him before, "why each of these fraudulent accounts can be traced directly back to instructions bearing your personal seal." The room fell silent. Cassius's eyes darted briefly toward the door, and Elena saw the calculation taking place behind his gaze, the swift assessment of whether escape or continued denial offered the better path forward. "This is absurd," Cassius said finally, his voice rising slightly, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. "I will not sit here and be accused of theft based on documents that could easily have been falsified by anyone seeking to discredit me." "Then perhaps," Alaric said, and something in his voice had changed entirely, the careful weariness replaced by a steady, commanding authority that made every person in the room turn toward him in surprise. "You would care to explain the events of a particular night, 3 years past, in the west tower of this very manor." Cassius's composure shattered entirely at these words, his face going pale as he stared at his cousin. "I do not know what you mean," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "I believe you do," Alaric said, and with slow, deliberate movement, He pressed his hands against the arms of his chair and rose to his feet. The room erupted into gasps and murmurs of shock. Griggs stepped forward instinctively, though it was clear from his expression that he had known this moment was coming, had perhaps helped prepare for it in ways Elena had not fully understood. Cassius stared at his cousin standing before him, tall and steady, every trace of the broken, wheelchair-bound man he had believed himself dealing with for years now entirely absent. "You have been pretending," Cassius said, his voice barely above a whisper, disbelief and dawning horror mingling in his expression. "All this time, you have been pretending. I needed you to believe yourself safe," Alaric said, his voice carrying across the silent room with quiet, devastating clarity. "I needed you to grow careless, to continue building the case against yourself while believing your cousin remained too broken to ever challenge you. And you did precisely that, Cassius. Every fraudulent transaction, every falsified record, has been carefully documented these past years, waiting for this very moment. This is impossible," Cassius said, though the desperation in his voice suggested he understood the truth of what was unfolding before him. "You could not have recovered so completely. I made certain." He stopped himself abruptly, but it was too late. The words hung in the air, and Elena watched as the three supposed auditors exchanged meaningful glances, their true identities as Crown investigators becoming clear to everyone present. "You made certain," Callahan repeated slowly, stepping forward with grim satisfaction. "Those words alone confirm what this evidence has already proven beyond reasonable doubt. Lord Cassius Ashford, you stand accused of orchestrating an attack upon your cousin, the Duke of Ashford, along with years of systematic theft from the very estate you claim to serve." Cassius's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for some avenue of escape, some argument that might yet save him from the consequences now closing in around him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of Wesley Barrow regarding the dismissed guards, the medical records from Dr. Holloway confirming injuries inconsistent with any accidental fall, the financial documents tracing years of fraudulent transactions directly to Cassius's own hand. There was no escape remaining, no clever argument that could unravel the careful case built against him. "Guards," Alaric said, his voice steady and commanding, and several men Elena had not previously recognized as anything more than household staff stepped forward, revealing themselves as agents working alongside Callahan's investigation. "See that Lord Cassius is placed under proper custody until the Crown's own courts can determine his fate." Cassius made one final, desperate attempt to protest his innocence as the guards moved to restrain him, his earlier charm and confidence entirely stripped away, revealing instead the desperate, calculating man who had been willing to harm his own family in pursuit of power and wealth. But his protests fell on ears that no longer believed his careful lies, and he was led from the manor in silence, the weight of years of deception finally collapsing upon him entirely. As the room slowly emptied, the Crown's investigators departing with Callahan to begin the formal proceedings against Cassius, Elena found herself standing alone with Alaric in the now quiet drawing room, still struggling to fully comprehend the magnitude of everything that had just unfolded. "It is over," she said softly, watching as he took a slow, careful step toward her, his movements still somewhat unsteady after years of pretended paralysis, but strong and genuine nonetheless. "It is over," Alaric agreed, reaching for her hand. "Years of careful deception, years of pretending to be broken while waiting for this very moment. I could not have managed it without your help, Elena, without your courage in seeking out the truth, even when I tried to keep you separate from the danger." "I could not have simply stood by," Elena said. "Not once I understood what truly lived within these walls. Not once I began to understand the man behind the careful mask you wore." Alaric's expression softened, something warm and genuine replacing the careful authority he had shown moments before during the confrontation with his cousin. "When this marriage was first arranged, I viewed you as simply another piece necessary to maintain my disguise, a convenient match that would raise no suspicion. I am ashamed to admit how little thought I gave to what such deception might cost you personally." "And now?" Elena asked, her heart beating quickly as she studied his face, searching for the answer to a question she had not fully realized she wished to ask until this very moment. "Now," Alaric said, reaching to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, "I find that I could not imagine facing whatever comes next without you beside me. Not as a convenient arrangement born of necessity, but as someone I have come to genuinely admire and care for beyond anything I expected when this began." Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they carried none of the sorrow and fear that had marked her arrival at Ashford Manor weeks before. Instead, they carried something far warmer, something closer to genuine hope for whatever future might now lie ahead of them both. "Then let us face it together," she said. not as strangers bound by circumstance but as two people who have chosen at last to truly know one another. Outside the manor's windows, the pale morning sky had given way to bright, clear sunlight, illuminating gardens that seemed, for the first time since Elena's arrival, to hold genuine promise, rather than simply careful, guarded secrets. The long shadow that Cassius Ashford had cast over this household for years had finally lifted, and in its place, something new and genuine had begun to take root between two people who had never expected to find real connection within a marriage forced upon them both. Word of Cassius's arrest spread quickly through the county in the days that followed, and Elena watched as the household staff, once so carefully guarded and distant, began to relax into something closer to genuine warmth and openness. Nora, in particular, seemed delighted by the change, often catching Elena's eye with a knowing smile whenever she observed the growing closeness between the Duke and his once reluctant bride. Alaric's recovery continued steadily in the weeks that followed, his strength returning fully, as he no longer needed to maintain the careful pretense that had confined him for so long. He began riding again, much to the household's evident joy, and Elena often joined him on these rides, the two of them exploring the estate's grounds together in a way that would have seemed impossible only months before. Elena's father, informed of the dramatic events at Ashford Manor, arrived several weeks later to see his daughter, his relief evident upon finding her genuinely happy, rather than simply resigned to a difficult fate. Whatever debts had originally forced this marriage into being, Alaric ensured they were settled fully, freeing Elena's family from the desperate circumstances that had once compelled such a difficult decision. "I never intended for you to suffer for my family's misfortune," her father said quietly, during a private moment in the manor's gardens. "I do not believe I have suffered, father," Elena replied, watching as Alaric approached them from across the lawn, his stride confident and strong, nothing like the broken man she had first married. "Whatever circumstances brought me here, I find that I have gained far more than I ever expected to lose." Her father studied her expression for a long moment before nodding, his own eyes glistening slightly. Then perhaps some difficult beginnings do lead toward genuine happiness after all. As Alaric joined them, reaching for Elena's hand with the easy familiarity of two people who had come to trust and care for one another deeply, Elena felt a genuine sense of peace settle over her, one she had not thought possible during those first frightening days at Ashford Manor. The forced marriage that had once felt like a prison sentence had transformed, through shared danger and hard-won trust, into something she now recognized as genuine partnership and love. The Duke of Ashford had risen, both from his chair and from years of careful hiding, and in doing so, had revealed not only the truth of Cassius's treachery, but also the truth of his own genuine character, one that Elena had come to know and cherish, far beyond anything she could have imagined on that difficult morning when she had first climbed into a carriage bound for an uncertain future. Months passed, and Ashford Manor became a very different place from the quiet, guarded household Elena had first entered. The Crown's court had proceeded swiftly against Cassius, and with the overwhelming evidence presented against him, including Wesley Barrow's testimony, Dr. Holloway's medical records, and the extensive financial documentation Callahan had assembled, he was stripped entirely of his claims to any future title or inheritance connected to the Ashford family. He was sent far from the county to answer fully for his crimes, and Elena felt a quiet sense of closure knowing that the shadow he had cast over the household for so many years would trouble them no further. With Cassius's threat finally removed, Alaric turned his attention toward rebuilding the estate that had suffered under years of hidden theft. He worked closely with Griggs and the household staff to restore proper order to the finances, ensuring that tenants and workers who had perhaps suffered under reduced resources during Cassius's schemes were properly compensated and cared for. Elena found herself deeply involved in these efforts as well, discovering a genuine talent for managing household affairs and a real interest in the well-being of those who depended upon the estate for their livelihood. Dr. Holloway remained a welcome guest at the manor in the months that followed, no longer forced to maintain careful ambiguity in his medical reports, and he often expressed quiet pride at how fully Alaric had recovered, both physically and in spirit, from the ordeal that had confined him for so long. "I confess," Holloway said one afternoon during a visit to check on Alaric's continued progress, "there were nights I feared you might never fully recover the use of your legs, regardless of how carefully we managed the deception. It is a genuine relief to see you standing so strong before me now. I could not have managed it without your quiet courage these past years," Alaric replied. "You risked a great deal, refusing to fully falsify your reports despite the pressure you must have felt." "Some things matter more than convenience," Holloway said simply. And Elena, watching this exchange, felt a renewed appreciation for the quiet network of loyal individuals who had helped protect Alaric through years of careful deception, each of them risking their own safety for the sake of eventual justice. Wesley Barrow, the former guard whose testimony had proven so crucial in confirming Cassius's involvement in the attack, was offered a permanent position within the estate's household staff as a gesture of gratitude for his courage in coming forward. He accepted gladly, relieved finally to be free of the guilt that had weighed upon him for years regarding his unwitting role in that fateful night. As the estate settled into its new rhythm of honest management and genuine prosperity, Elena and Alaric's relationship continued to deepen in ways neither had anticipated when their forced marriage first began. What had started as an arrangement born of desperate necessity had transformed gradually into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared courage, and genuine affection that grew stronger with each passing month. One evening, as autumn began to settle over the estate's gardens, painting the leaves in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Alaric led Elena toward the very chapel where they had first exchanged their vows under such difficult circumstances. "Do you remember our wedding day?" he asked, as they stood together near the chapel's entrance. "I remember feeling as though my life had ended," Elena admitted honestly. "I remember a man who would not meet my eyes, who spoke his vows as though reciting a lesson, rather than making a genuine promise." "I am sorry for the pain that day caused you," Alaric said. "You deserved better than fear and uncertainty on what should have been a joyful occasion." "And yet," Elena said, reaching for his hand, "I find that I would not change the path that led us here, difficult as it was. Whatever pain that day held, it led toward something I have come to treasure far more than I ever expected." Alaric turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a warmth and sincerity that would have seemed impossible from the careful, guarded man she had first married. "Then perhaps we might exchange new vows, Elena. Not out of necessity or desperate circumstance, but from genuine choice and affection freely given." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes as she understood the significance of what he was proposing. "I would like that very much," she said softly. There, in the quiet chapel where their difficult journey together had first begun, Alaric and Elena spoke new vows to one another, this time with genuine warmth and understanding, replacing the fear and uncertainty of that first difficult ceremony. There were no crowds, no elaborate celebration, simply two people who had endured genuine danger together and emerged with a bond far stronger than either could have anticipated when their marriage was first forced upon them. In the years that followed, Ashford Manor flourished under their combined care. The tenants who worked the estate's lands spoke often of the genuine kindness and fairness shown by both the Duke and his Duchess, a stark contrast to the years of hidden corruption that had preceded their partnership. Elena's father visited often, his relationship with his daughter healed fully by the genuine happiness he witnessed each time he arrived at the manor, and Nora remained a beloved member of the household staff, often recounting to newer servants the dramatic story of how the manor's fortunes had changed so completely. Alaric never forgot the years of careful deception he had endured, nor the courage it had taken Elena to seek out truth even when doing so placed her in genuine danger. He often reflected during quiet evenings spent together in the study where so many of their careful plans had first taken shape, on how remarkable it was that a marriage born from such difficult and forced circumstances had transformed into the truest partnership he could have ever hoped to find. "I once believed," he told Elena one evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the estate's gardens, "that I would spend the remainder of my days alone behind careful walls of deception, protecting myself and this estate through isolation and quiet suffering. I never imagined that a forced marriage, born from desperate circumstances neither of us chose, would lead me toward genuine happiness I had long since given up hoping to find." "Nor did I imagine," Elena replied, resting her head against his shoulder as the golden light of evening settled softly over them both, "that the frightened girl who climbed into that carriage all those months ago would find herself here, genuinely content, genuinely loved, and genuinely home." And so the story of Ashford Manor, once marked by fear, deception, and hidden danger, became instead a story remembered throughout the county for its remarkable transformation, a tale of courage overcoming treachery, and of two people who had found genuine love in circumstances neither had ever chosen, yet neither would ever wish to have avoided. The Duke had risen, in every sense the words could carry, and beside him stood the woman who had refused to accept easy lies, who had sought truth even when danger threatened, and who had ultimately helped him reclaim not only his rightful place, but also a genuine chance at happiness he had long believed impossible to find.